She knelt in the dirt outside the saloon, cradling her shattered hands while blood dripped between her fingers, and whispered through broken sobs to the Comanche warrior who had just dismounted. "They broke my hands for serving you, and what he did next would make every man in Bent Creek wish they'd never touched her." The Texas sun beat down on Bent Creek like a hammer on an anvil, turning the dusty main street into a shimmering haze that made the buildings waver like ghosts. Mary Coulter had learned to move through that heat the way a fish moves through water, silent and efficient, her worn boots making barely a sound on the warped boards of the Dusty Rose Saloon. She'd been working there for 3 months now, ever since the stagecoach had deposited her in this godforsaken town with nothing but a carpet bag and $2 to her name. Now, the saloon smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and the sour sweat of men who worked cattle from dawn till dusk. Virgil Dockery owned the place, a portly man with thinning hair and eyes that assessed everything in terms of profit. He wasn't cruel exactly, just indifferent, which in some ways felt worse. Mary served drinks, wiped tables, and dodged wandering hands with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that survival meant staying invisible. But invisibility was a luxury she'd lost the day Tavo walked through those swinging doors. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the heat made even the flies lazy. Mary had been clearing glasses from a corner table when the entire saloon went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a slow day, but the breathless hush of predators sensing something dangerous. She looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, backlit by the fierce Texas sun, so that he appeared almost like a vision. Tall, broad-shouldered, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders and skin the color of desert copper. He wore a mix of Comanche and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings, and a dark cotton shirt, with a red cloth tied around his head. 2 revolvers sat low on his hips, and a rifle was slung across his back. But it wasn't the weapons that made the room hold its breath. It was the way he stood, utterly still, utterly certain, like a mountain that had no need to prove itself. Clayton Merrick was the first to speak. He sat at his usual table near the back, surrounded by 5 of his ranch hands, men who wore their cruelty as casually as their hats. Merrick was a cattle baron who'd built his empire on stolen land and broken treaties, and he made sure everyone in Bent Creek knew it. "Well now," he drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Looks like we got ourselves a lost Indian. Reservation's 20 miles north, boy. Best get moving before someone mistakes you for trouble." Tavo's eyes swept the room with a calm that bordered on indifference. When he spoke, his English was perfect, though touched with an accent that made each word sound deliberate. "I'm here for supplies and a meal. I have coin to pay." He produced a small leather pouch and let it clink on the bar. The sound of silver was unmistakable. Virgil Dockery licked his lips nervously, his eyes darting between Tavo and Merrick. The math was simple. Comanche money spent as well as anyone else's, but Merrick's goodwill kept his saloon from burning down. Before Virgil could make his cowardly calculation, Marie surprised herself by stepping forward. "I'll serve him," she said quietly. The words were out before she could think better of them. Every eye in the room turned to her. She felt Merrick's gaze like a physical weight, assessing, calculating. But she also saw something flicker in Tavo's dark eyes, a brief flash of surprise, perhaps even respect. She picked up a clean glass and a bottle of whiskey from behind the bar, her hands steady despite the thundering of her heart. "Table by the window suit you?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Tavo nodded once, a slight inclination of his head that somehow conveyed both gratitude and acknowledgement. He moved to the table with a grace that made the floorboards silent beneath his weight, while Marie followed, intensely aware of the hostile stares burning into her back. She poured the whiskey with hands that didn't shake, though she could feel Merrick's men shifting in their seats like wolves, readying to pounce. "Menus beef stew or beef stew?" she said, managing a small smile. "Cook's not much for variety." The corner of Tavo's mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. "Stew is good." "Thank you." His voice was low and measured, and there was something in the way he looked at her. really looked at her not through her or at her body, but at her face, her eyes, as if she were a person worth seeing. It had been so long since anyone had looked at Mari that way that she almost forgot to breathe. She brought him the stew 20 minutes later, a generous portion with fresh bread she'd baked that morning. As she set it down, Merrick's voice cut across the room like a blade. "Hey, Mari, you gone soft on Indians now? Next thing you'll be inviting him to Sunday service." Laughter erupted from his table, cruel and sharp. Mari's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes down and turned to walk away. Tavo's voice stopped her, quiet but clear. "The bread smells like cedar smoke and honey. You baked it yourself?" She turned back, surprised. "Yes, how did you know?" His eyes held hers. "My mother used to bake bread over cedar fires. Same smell, same care." It was such a simple thing, that observation, but it hit Mari somewhere deep in her chest, where she'd locked away all the tender parts of herself. For the next hour, Tavo ate in silence, while the saloon slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Though the tension never fully dissipated, men muttered into their drinks and shot dark looks toward the window table. Merrick's crew kept up a steady stream of comments, loud enough to be heard, but vague enough to avoid direct confrontation. When Tavo finally rose to leave, he placed exact payment on the table, along with an extra silver dollar. "For the bread," he said simply. Mari picked up the coin, feeling its weight. $1 was half a week's wages. "That's too much," she protested. Tavo was already halfway to the door when he turned back. "No, it's exactly right." Then he was gone, stepping out into the blazing afternoon, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threat. Virgil appeared at her elbow the moment the doors stopped swinging. "That was foolish, girl. Merrick doesn't forget slights, and serving that Comanche will be seen as one." Mari slipped the silver dollar into her apron pocket and met Virgil's watery eyes. "He paid good money. Isn't that what matters?" Virgil's face twisted with something between pity and irritation. "Money ain't everything when you're trying to stay alive in a town like this." He was right, of course. Mari had seen enough of the world to know that small acts of decency could carry steep prices. But she'd also learned that refusing every act of kindness turned you into something hollow, something not quite human. She went back to work, wiping tables and refilling glasses, trying to ignore the weight of hostile stares that followed her for the rest of the day. The afternoon stretched long and oppressive, with heat radiating off the wooden walls and making the air thick enough to choke on. Mari kept her head down, moving between tables with mechanical efficiency, but she could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The other saloon girls, Beatrice and Ruth, gave her wide berth, their eyes sympathetic but distant. They'd learned the same lesson she had. In a town like Bent Creek, solidarity was a luxury you couldn't afford when your own survival hung by a thread. By evening, when the oil lamps were lit and the serious drinking began, Merrick had worked himself into a state. She could hear him holding court at his table, voice growing louder with each whiskey. "Imagine that," he was saying to anyone who'd listen. "A white woman showing preference to a savage over her own kind. Makes you wonder what other preferences she might have." The implication hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and choking. Mari's face burned, but she kept working. She'd heard worse, survived worse. Words were just air, she told herself, even as they landed like fists against her ribs. When she passed Merrick's table to collect empty glasses, one of his men, a weasel-faced ranch hand named Pike, stuck his boot out. She saw it coming and stepped over it, but Pike grabbed her skirt. "Where you running to, Indian lover? Afraid to spend time with white folk now?" She yanked her skirt free, spilling whiskey from the glasses she carried. The amber liquid splashed across the table, and Merrick rose with exaggerated outrage. "Now look what you've done. Clumsy as well as disloyal." He grabbed her wrist, the same one he'd squeezed earlier, and pain shot up her arm. "Maybe you need a lesson in gratitude. Virgil here gives you work, gives you a place, and this is how you repay him. Serving savages and spilling good whiskey." "Let go," Mari said through gritted teeth, but Merrick only tightened his grip. She could feel the bones in her wrist grinding together, see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. This was what men like him lived for, these small demonstrations of power, these moments when they could make someone weaker hurt. Virgil appeared, wringing his hands. "Merrick, please." She didn't mean nothing by it. Just doing her job, that's all. Merrick released her with a shove that sent her stumbling into a nearby table. "Her job is to serve who I say she serves. You hear me, Dockery? That Indian comes back, she turns him away, or I'll assume you're taking sides against me. And you know what happens to people who take sides against me." The threat hung there unmistakable. Virgil nodded, defeated. "She'll turn him away. Won't you, Mari?" Every eye in the saloon was on her. She could feel the weight of their expectation, their fear, their relief that it was her and not them. She touched her throbbing wrist and thought about all the times she'd bent, all the times she'd made herself small to avoid exactly this kind of attention. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'll turn him away." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. Merrick seemed satisfied. He threw back the rest of his whiskey and slammed the glass down. "Smart girl. See that you remember it." He left with his men trailing behind him like jackals following a lion, their laughter echoing in the street long after the doors had swung shut. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mari moved through her tasks with numb efficiency, her wrist throbbing with each movement. When the last patron had stumbled out and Virgil had locked the doors, she found herself standing in the empty saloon, surrounded by dirty glasses and overturned chairs. The place smelled of stale beer and broken promises. Beatrice touched her shoulder gently. "You all right, honey?" Mari nodded, though it was another lie. "I'm fine." Beatrice, who was older and had worked saloons from Denver to San Antonio, gave her a look that said she knew better. "Men like Merrick don't give warnings twice. You'd do well to remember that." Then she gathered her shawl and slipped out the back door, leaving Mari alone with the wreckage. She cleaned in silence, her thoughts churning. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to do exactly as Merrick demanded. Turn Tavo away if he returned. Preserve her position, her safety, her small corner of survival in this hostile world. It was what any sensible person would do. But Mari found herself thinking about the way Tavo had thanked her, the respect in his voice, the memory of his mother's bread. She thought about his 3 years in a mission school, being broken by men who thought they had the right. And she thought about herself, about all the pieces of her humanity she'd already surrendered just to keep breathing. When she finally left the saloon, the night was cool and clear. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. She walked slowly back to her room, her wrist wrapped in a cloth soaked in cold water. The streets were mostly empty, just a few drunks sleeping it off in doorways and the distant sound of a piano from one of the other establishments. As she passed the livery stable, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. Her heart jumped into her throat until she recognized Ben Tucker, the dry goods store owner. "Evening, Miss Coulter," he said quietly. Ben was one of the few people in Bent Creek who treated her with consistent kindness, though he was too old and too cautious to risk Merrick's wrath by being openly friendly. "Heard there was trouble at the saloon tonight. News traveled fast in small towns." Mari managed a tired smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Ben studied her with kind, sad eyes. "That Comanche who came through, he's got a reputation. They say he's fair, but he don't forgive insults. Merrick would do well to remember that." He paused, then added, "Man, so would you, I suppose. Be careful, Miss Coulter. This town's got a way of eating up good people." She thanked him and continued on, his words echoing in her mind. In her small room above the general store, she lit a candle and sat by the window, looking out at the sleeping town. Bent Creek wasn't much, just a collection of wooden buildings clinging to existence in the middle of nowhere, but it was all she had. Leaving would mean starting over again, and she was so tired of starting over. But staying meant bending until she broke, and she wasn't sure how much more bending she had left in her. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching the door, her heart jumping every time it opened. 3 days of Merrick's men watching her with knowing smirks, waiting to see if she'd defy their boss. 3 days of Virgil's nervous glances and the other girl's careful distance. The bruises on her wrist faded from purple to yellow-green, but the ache remained. a constant reminder of how quickly safety could turn to threat. On the fourth day, just as the afternoon heat reached its peak, the saloon doors swung open and Tavo walked in. The reaction was immediate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Hearts froze mid-deal. Every head turned toward the door, then swiveled to find Mari behind the bar. She felt the weight of those stares like physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs. Tavo's dark eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw something that might have been a question, or perhaps just acknowledgement. He moved toward his usual table by the window. Virgil materialized at her elbow, his face pale and sweating. "Mari, remember what I said. What Merrick said." His voice was barely a whisper, urgent and frightened. She looked at her employer, this man who'd given her work when she was desperate, who paid her fairly if not generously, who was also too weak to stand up for anything beyond his own survival. She looked at Tavo, waiting patiently at the table, his posture relaxed but alert. Then she looked at her own hands, still tender from Merrick's grip, and made her choice. She picked up a clean glass and a bottle of whiskey and walked toward Tavo's table. The gasp that went through the room was almost audible. Virgil made a strangled sound behind her. Someone muttered, "She's dead." But Mari kept walking, her spine straight, her steps measured. When she reached the table, she set down the glass and poured the whiskey with steady hands. "Welcome back," she said, and her voice didn't shake. Tavo's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, warm and approving. "Thank you." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Will you sit?" It was such an unexpected request that Mari almost laughed. No patron had ever asked her to sit before. She was furniture, decoration, a mechanism for delivering food and drink. But Tavo was looking at her as if her answer mattered, as if she were a person whose company might be valued. "I'm working," she said, though part of her wanted desperately to accept. He nodded, understanding. "Another time, perhaps. I'll have the stew if there is any." As she turned to go, he added quietly, "I heard there was trouble after my last visit. I apologize for bringing difficulty to your door." Mari looked back at him, this Comanche warrior who was apologizing for other men's cruelty, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "It wasn't your fault. And I'd do it again." The words were out before she could stop them, reckless and true. A smile touched Tavo's lips, brief as lightning. "I believe you would." She brought him his meal, served him with the same care she'd shown before, and ignored the murderous stares from the other patrons. Virgil had disappeared into the back room, unable to watch what he couldn't prevent. The other girls gave her looks that mixed pity with disbelief, already mourning her as if she were dead. And perhaps she was, Mari thought. Perhaps she'd just signed her own death warrant by choosing dignity over survival. But as she watched Tavo eat the food she'd prepared, as she saw him nod his thanks with that quiet respect, she found she didn't regret it. When he left, he placed payment on the table along with another silver dollar. This time Mari didn't protest. She simply met his eyes and said, "Be safe." He paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. "And you," he replied. Then he was gone, leaving her standing in a room full of hostile faces, her fate sealed by her own choice. Merrick arrived within the hour. Merrick didn't come alone. The sound of horses announced their arrival before Mari saw them through the saloon's dusty windows, 6 riders pulling up in a cloud of dust that hung in the late afternoon air like a threat made visible. She was wiping down tables when the doors burst open, and Merrick strode in with his men, fanning out behind him like an invading army. His face was flushed red, whether from rage or whiskey or both, Mari couldn't tell. "You," he said, pointing at her with a thick finger, "you think you can make a fool of me?" His voice carried through the saloon, silencing the handful of patrons who'd been nursing drinks. Virgil emerged from the back room, his face the color of old parchment, hands already raised in placation. "Now, Merrick, let's talk about this reasonable like." "No need for—" Merrick backhanded him without even looking, sending Virgil sprawling into a table that collapsed under his weight with a crash of splintering wood. "I'm done talking dockery. I gave clear instructions." She defied them. "That means she defies me." He turned back to Mari, and the look in his eyes was something beyond anger, something cold and calculating that made her blood turn to ice. "You think that Comanche's going to protect you? He's probably halfway to the Llano Estacado by now, and you're here alone with no one to speak for you." Mari's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze even as fear clawed at her throat. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness to men like Merrick was like showing blood to sharks. "I was doing my job. He's a paying customer. Your job," Merrick said, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, "is what I say it is. This whole town is what I say it is. The land, the cattle, the water rights, even the people, they exist because I allow them to exist." He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the broken blood vessels in his nose. "You need to learn your place, girl. And I'm going to teach you." His hand shot out and grabbed her right wrist, the one he'd bruised before, and pain exploded up her arm. But this time he didn't stop it squeezing. He twisted, yanking her arm behind her back with such force that something popped in her shoulder. Mari gasped, her vision going white at the edges, but she refused to scream. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Boss," one of his men said nervously, "maybe we should." Merrick silenced him with a look. "Maybe you should what, go soft? This town's got to know there are consequences for disrespect." He shoved Mari forward, and she stumbled, catching herself on a table. Her right arm hung useless, a sickening throb radiating from her shoulder. "But I'm feeling merciful today. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your knees and apologize." Mari looked at him, at the cruel satisfaction in his face, at his men standing behind him with varying degrees of discomfort and anticipation. She looked at Virgil, still on the floor, blood trickling from his split lip, his eyes begging her to just comply. She looked at Beatrice and Ruth huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. And she thought about every time she'd gotten on her knees before, every time she'd swallowed her dignity to survive, every piece of herself she'd handed over to cruel men who took and took and took. "No," she said quietly. The word hung in the air for a moment, impossible and defiant. Merrick's eyes widened, not with anger at first, but with genuine surprise, as if a chair had suddenly spoken. Then the anger came, volcanic and overwhelming. "What did you say?" "Agree, I said no." Mari's voice was stronger now, even as her arm screamed with pain. "I won't apologize for treating someone with basic human decency. If that makes me disrespectful in your eyes, then I'd rather be disrespectful than become whatever you are." For a moment, she thought he might actually kill her right there. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, and she saw his finger curl around the grip. The saloon held its breath. Then Merrick smiled, and somehow that was worse than his anger. "You want to be brave? Let me show you what happens to brave women." He turned to his men. "Pike, Jackson, hold her." Two of his ranch hands grabbed her arms, and fresh agony tore through her injured shoulder. They forced her to her knees on the rough wooden floor, holding her in place, while Merrick walked behind the bar and selected a heavy bottle of whiskey. He returned, rolling up his sleeves with deliberate slowness, enjoying every second of her fear. "Your hands," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "That's what you used to serve that savage, isn't it?" Seems fitting. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. "No, please." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she hated herself for the fear in her voice. Her hands were everything, her ability to work, to survive, to maintain the small independence she'd clawed together. Without them, she was nothing. Merrick set the bottle down and grabbed her left hand, forcing it flat against the table. She struggled, but Pike and Jackson held her firm, and her injured shoulder made resistance agony. "This is going to hurt," Merrick said with mock sympathy. "But pain's a good teacher. You'll remember this next time you think about defying me." He raised the bottle high and brought it down with brutal force. The sound of bones breaking was like dry twigs snapping, multiple cracks that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Pain unlike anything Mari had ever experienced exploded through her hand, up her arm, into her brain, until it was all she knew. This time she did scream, a sound ripped from somewhere primal and animal. Her vision went black at the edges, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. But Merrick wasn't done. Through the haze of agony, she felt him grab her right hand, force it flat beside the shattered left. "One more," he said, "so you don't forget." The bottle rose again. "Stop!" The shout came from the doorway, and for one wild moment Mari thought it was Tavo, that he'd somehow known and returned. But it was Ben Tucker, the old store owner, standing in the entrance with a shotgun that looked ancient and probably didn't even work. His hands were shaking so badly the barrel wavered in circles. "You let her go, Merrick." "This ain't right." Merrick turned, the bottle still raised, and laughed. "You going to shoot me, old man? You don't have the spine." He was right, they all knew it. Ben's finger wasn't even on the trigger, and the fear in his eyes was palpable. But he'd tried, and that small act of courage gave Mari something to hold on to as darkness threatened to pull her under. "Get out of here before I lose my temper," Merrick said. Ben stood there for 3 more heartbeats, the shotgun shaking, then slowly lowered the weapon and backed out of the doorway. Merrick turned back to Mari with a satisfied smirk. "Now, where were we?" The second bottle came down just as hard, and this time Mari felt something fundamental break. Not just bones, but something deeper, something in her spirit that had been holding her together. She heard herself screaming again, distant and detached, as if the sounds were coming from someone else. Her hands were fire and agony, useless broken things at the ends of her arms. Merrick released her, and she collapsed to the floor, cradling her ruined hands against her chest. Through tears and pain, she saw him wipe his hands on a barcloth as casually as if he'd just finished honest work. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here," he announced to the room. "This is what happens when you forget who runs this town. When you forget that there's an order to things, and that order keeps you all safe." He dropped a few coins on the bar, payment for the bottles he'd used as weapons. "Dockery, you might want to find yourself a new saloon girl. This one seems a bit broken." His men laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and followed him out into the fading daylight. The door swung shut behind them, and for a long moment no one moved. Then Beatrice and Ruth rushed forward, their faces stricken. "Oh, honey, oh God," Beatrice whispered, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside Mari. "We have to get you to Doc Wilson." But Mari barely heard her. The pain was enormous, consuming, but worse was the realization of what this meant. Her hands, her livelihood, her independence, everything she'd built in this harsh world had just been taken from her with 2 swings of a bottle. They carried her out the back way, Beatrice and Ruth supporting her weight while Virgil stayed behind, already cleaning up the broken table and spilled whiskey as if he could wipe away what had happened. The evening air was cool on Mari's face, a sharp contrast to the fire in her hands. Each step sent fresh waves of agony through her, and she bit her lip until she tasted blood to keep from screaming again. Doc Wilson's office was above the barber shop, a cramped space that smelled of carbolic acid and old leather. The doctor was a grey-haired man with steady hands and sad eyes who'd seen too much suffering to be shocked by any of it. He took one look at Mari's hands, and his jaw tightened. "Merrick?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Beatrice nodded, helping Mari into a chair. Doc Wilson lit more lamps and laid out his instruments with practiced efficiency. "This is going to hurt," he said gently. "I can give you laudanum, but I don't have much." Mari nodded, beyond words, and he administered the drug with careful precision. The world began to soften at the edges, the pain receding to something almost bearable as he worked, setting bones and splinting her hands with thin strips of wood and clean bandages. Doc Wilson spoke in a low, steady voice. "I've lived in Bent Creek for 20 years. Watched Merrick build his empire on the backs of good people. Seen him break anyone who stood against him." He secured the last bandage and met Mari's eyes. "But I've also seen empires fall. Nothing lasts forever, especially nothing built on cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Mari wanted to believe him, but looking at her hands, wrapped in white bandages already seeping red, she couldn't find hope anywhere in her shattered world. "How long?" She managed to ask through the laudanum haze, "Until they heal. 6 weeks, maybe 8. And even then, they may never work quite right. Bones broken that badly, nerves damaged, there's no telling." He cleaned his instruments, not meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Coulter. If I could do more, I would." Ruth had been standing by the window, keeping watch. Now she turned, her young face tight with anger. She can't go back to the saloon. Virgil won't take her, not like this. And Merrick's men will be watching. Beatrice nodded grimly. "She can stay with me tonight. My room's small, but it'll do." After that, she trailed off because they all knew there was no after that. A saloon girl with broken hands had no future in Bent Creek. They helped Mari down the stairs as full dark settled over the town, moving through back alleys to avoid attention. Beatrice's room was indeed small, barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it felt safe after the violence of the saloon. They settled Mari on the bed, propping her splintered hands on pillows. The laudanum was pulling her down into foggy darkness. But before she surrendered to it, she whispered, "I should have just apologized." Beatrice smoothed hair back from her forehead with a gentleness that made Mari want to weep. "No, honey, you stood up. That takes more courage than most people ever find. Don't let him take that from you too." But as Mari drifted into uneasy sleep, she couldn't help thinking that courage was a luxury that people like her couldn't afford, and that standing up had only gotten her broken. She woke several times during the night, pain dragging her up from troubled dreams where bottles fell like rain and Merrick's laughter echoed endlessly. Each time, Beatrice was there with water and soft words, adjusting the pillows, checking the bandages. As dawn light began to grey the window, Mari lay awake, staring at her ruined hands. They looked like strange foreign objects, these wrapped and useless things. She tried to move her fingers and felt only distant, nauseating pain. "What am I going to do?" she whispered to the empty room. Beatrice had finally fallen asleep in the chair, exhausted from her night-long vigil. Mari knew the answer already. She had maybe $5 saved, not nearly enough to leave town or start over somewhere new. She couldn't work, couldn't earn money, couldn't even dress herself or feed herself properly. She was dependent on the charity of others, and charity in a place like Bent Creek ran thin when Merrick was involved. A knock at the door made them both jump. Beatrice jerked awake, her hand going to the small knife she kept in her boot. "Who is it?" she called out, voice sharp with fear. "Ben Tucker, ma'am. I brought some things." Beatrice opened the door a crack, then wider, when she saw the old man standing there with a basket. He stepped inside quickly, glancing nervously down the hall. "Brought some bread and preserves," he said, setting the basket on the small table. "And this." He pulled out a small cloth bag that clinked with coins. "It's not much, maybe $15. Collected it from some folks around town who felt bad about what happened." Mari stared at the bag, tears burning in her eyes. "I can't accept." Ben held up a hand. "You can and you will. Merrick might run this town through fear, but there are still decent people here. Not brave enough to stand against him openly, but decent enough to help where they can." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "That Comanche Tavo. Someone rode out to find him last night. Told him what happened." Mari's heart lurched in her chest. "Who?" Ben's smile was slight and knowing. "Does it matter? Point is, he knows. And if half the stories about him are true, he'll be coming back." Then he was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. The day passed in a blur of pain and unwanted visitors. Doc Wilson came to check her bandages and administer more laudanum. Ruth brought food that Mari couldn't eat, her stomach roiling with pain and fear. Virgil appeared briefly, wringing his hands and offering weak apologies before scurrying away like the coward he was. And through it all, Mari lay in that small room and wondered if this was how her story ended, broken and dependent in a town that had no use for broken things. As evening approached, Beatrice left to work her shift at the saloon, leaving Mari alone with her thoughts and her pain. She dozed fitfully, dreaming of hands that worked and a life that made sense. When she woke, the room was dark except for a single candle, and someone was sitting in the chair beside her bed. Her heart jumped before she recognized the silhouette. Tavo sat perfectly still, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. He'd removed his hat, and his long hair fell loose around his shoulders. In the candlelight, his face was all planes and shadows, beautiful and severe. "You came," Mari whispered, her voice rough from disuse and laudanum. "Of course I came." His voice was low and controlled, but she could hear something beneath it, something hot and dangerous. "Tell me what happened." "All of it." So she did, haltingly at first. Then in a rush of words that came with tears she'd been holding back. She told him about Merrick's ultimatum, about her choice to serve Tavo anyway, about the bottle and the breaking, and the pain that still consumed her world. As she spoke, she watched his face, waiting for judgment or pity, but saw neither. What she saw instead was rage, cold and absolute, contained behind iron control. When she finished, Tavo was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing words too dangerous to speak. Finally he said, "They broke your hands because you showed me kindness." "Yes," Mari whispered. Tavo rose from the chair and moved to the window, looking out at the dark street. His hands, she noticed, were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles pale with pressure. "In my mother's lodge there was a teaching. When someone harms you, you must respond not with equal harm, but with such certainty that they never consider harming anyone again." He turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "I will make this right. He'll kill you," Mari said, fear for him suddenly overwhelming her own pain. "He has 6 men, maybe more. He owns this town, Tavo. You can't—" He crossed back to her bedside and knelt so they were eye to eye. "Listen to me carefully. Men like Merrick believe they're untouchable because no one has ever truly challenged them. They mistake fear for respect, compliance for victory. But I am not afraid, and I do not comply." He reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her bandaged hand with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "Tomorrow, when the sun is highest and the town is watching, I will go to Merrick. I will give him one chance to make this right. To compensate you, to leave you in peace, to acknowledge what he's done. If he refuses—" Tavo's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Then I will show this town what justice looks like when law fails." Mari wanted to argue, to tell him to run, to save himself. But looking into his eyes, she knew it would be pointless. Whatever was going to happen had already been set in motion the moment Merrick broke her hands. "Why?" she asked instead. "Why does this matter so much to you? I'm just a saloon girl who served you a meal." Tavo's hand moved from her bandaged fingers to her face, cupping her cheek with a touch so gentle it made her want to weep. "You are not just anything. You are someone who saw me as human when others saw only Comanche. You chose dignity over safety, kindness over fear. That matters. You matter." His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized was falling. "And men who break what matters must answer for it." He stayed with her through the night, sitting in that chair, a silent guardian against the darkness and the pain. Mari drifted in and out of laudanum-induced sleep, and each time she woke he was there, solid and real, proof that she wasn't as alone as she'd feared. As dawn approached and the first birds began their singing, Tavo finally spoke again. "Rest today. Heal what you can. Tomorrow things will change." He stood, settling his hat back on his head, checking his revolvers with the practiced ease of someone who'd used them before. At the door, he paused and looked back at her one last time. "I will make them wish they'd never touched you," he said, and it wasn't a promise or a threat, just a simple statement of fact. Then he was gone, and Mari was left alone with the rising sun, and the certain knowledge that Bent Creek was about to learn what happened when you broke a Comanche warrior's peace. The morning sun climbed over Bent Creek like a judge ascending the bench, casting long shadows that stretched across the dusty street like accusing fingers. Mari woke to the sound of urgent voices outside Beatrice's window, townspeople moving with unusual purpose, their conversations tight with anticipation. Something was happening, something that had drawn them from their homes and businesses like moths to flame. Beatrice burst through the door, her face flushed from running. "He's here," she said breathlessly, moving to help Mari sit up. "Tavo." He rode in at dawn, and he's been waiting in the street for 2 hours, just sitting on his horse in front of Merrick's ranch office. Haven't seen nothing like it. The whole town's gathering to watch. Mari's heart seized in her chest. I have to get down there. I have to stop this. She tried to rise from the bed, but pain exploded through her hands and injured shoulder, sending her crashing back against the pillows with a gasp. The laudanum had worn off during the night, leaving her with nothing but raw agony and the sick certainty that Tavo was about to die because of her. You can't even stand, honey, Beatrice said gently. But Mari could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to watch, they all did, wanted to see if someone would finally stand up to Clayton Merrick, even if it meant watching that someone die trying. Doc Wilson's downstairs. Says he'll stay with you, keep you updated on what happens. But Mari couldn't bear the thought of lying in this room while Tavo faced Merrick alone. Help me to the window, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. At least let me see. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. Together, they managed to get Mari to the chair by the window, propping her splinted hands on cushions. From here, she had a clear view down Main Street to where a crowd was gathering. The scene below looked like something from a fever dream. Tavo sat astride his horse, a magnificent paint stallion that stood perfectly still despite the growing crowd. He'd positioned himself directly in front of the Silver Star Ranch office, where Merrick conducted his business and held court like some frontier king. The Comanche warrior wore traditional clothing today, buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, his long hair braided and adorned with feathers. 2 revolvers sat on his hips, and his rifle rested across his saddle. He looked like something from another time, a ghost of the old ways refusing to fade. The crowd kept a respectful distance, forming a loose semicircle around him. Mari recognized faces: Ben Tucker with his ancient shotgun, Doc Wilson slipping through the crowd to stand near the front, the Reverend from the small church clutching his Bible, ranch hands and shopkeepers and saloon girls, all drawn by the promise of confrontation. Some faces showed hope, others fear, but all showed the same hungry anticipation of people who'd lived under Merrick's thumb too long. The door to the ranch office remained closed, though Mari could see movement behind the windows. Merrick was in there, she knew, calculating his response, deciding how to handle this unexpected challenge to his authority. Minutes stretched like hours, the tension building until the air itself felt brittle enough to shatter. Then the door opened, and Merrick emerged with 4 of his men. He dressed for the occasion too, wearing his finest suit and a silver-handled pistol that probably cost more than most people in Bent Creek earned in a year. His face was flushed, whether from anger or morning whiskey Mari couldn't tell, but his eyes were sharp and calculating as they fixed on Tavo. "You got some nerve," Merrick called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Riding into my town, making a spectacle. You got business here, Indian, or you just looking to die?" The crowd shifted nervously, but no one spoke. This was between Merrick and Tavo now, and everyone knew it. Tavo dismounted with fluid grace, his movements unhurried and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was calm but somehow carried to every ear present. "I'm here about the woman, Marianne Coulter. You broke her hands 2 days ago." The simple statement hung in the air, an accusation that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Merrick's lip curled into a sneer. "That saloon girl? She got what she deserved. Disobeyed a direct order, embarrassed me in front of my men. Had to make an example." He said it casually, as if breaking a woman's hands was no more significant than swatting a fly. "What's it to you anyway? She your woman now?" "She's a human being who showed me respect when others showed me contempt," Tavo replied, taking 3 steps forward. The movement was measured, bringing him closer to Merrick, but not close enough to be immediately threatening. "She served me a meal. For that kindness, you destroyed her livelihood, her independence, her future. I'm here to make that right." Merrick laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Make it right? You plan to challenge me, is that it? One Indian against me and my men?" He gestured to the 4 ranch hands flanking him, all armed, all watching Tavo with the cold eyes of men who'd killed before. "You're either brave or stupid, and I ain't sure which. I'm giving you a choice. Tavo said, and now Mari could hear steel beneath the calm. "You can pay Miss Coulter compensation. Enough to leave this town and start over somewhere safe. You can apologize publicly for what you've done. Do this and I'll ride away. Your authority remains intact. Your men remain loyal. Your empire continues." He paused, letting the offer settle. "Or you can refuse and learn what happens when power meets principle." The crowd held its breath. From her window, Mari could see the calculation in Merrick's eyes, the quick assessment of odds and outcomes. For a moment she thought he might actually take the offer, might choose survival over pride. But then his face hardened and she knew what he would say before he spoke. "I don't negotiate with savages," Merrick spat. "And I sure as hell don't apologize for maintaining order in my town. You want to die for some broken saloon girl, that's your choice. Boys!" He nodded to his men, and 4 hands dropped to gun belts. What happened next occurred so fast that Mari's eyes could barely track it. Tavo's hands moved in a blur, both revolvers clearing leather in a motion so smooth it seemed almost lazy. The first shot took Pike in the shoulder before his gun had cleared the holster, spinning him around and dropping him to the dirt. The second caught Jackson in the leg, and he went down screaming. The third and fourth shots came so close together they sounded like one, disarming the other 2 men by shooting the pistols from their hands in a display of marksmanship that defied belief. 4 men down in perhaps 3 seconds, and Tavo's guns were now trained on Merrick, who stood frozen with his hand on his silver-handled pistol, his face gone pale as milk. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, people stumbling backward, but Tavo didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe hard. "I didn't kill them," Tavo said quietly. "I could have. The first shot could have been to Pike's heart. The second through Jackson's head. I chose mercy." His dark eyes bored into Merrick. "Now you choose. Draw that fancy gun and die, or admit what you are. A coward who hurts women because he can't face real consequence." Merrick's hand trembled on his pistol grip. Mari could see the war playing out across his face, pride warring with survival, the lifetime of unchallenged authority crashing against the reality of someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought. His men groaned in the dirt, and still the crowd watched in breathless silence. "You can't do this," Merrick finally said, his voice higher than before, stripped of its usual confidence. "I own this town. The sheriff, the mayor, the judge, they all answer to me. You think you can just ride in here and—" His words cut off as Tavo took another step forward, closing the distance until he was within arm's reach. "I just did," Tavo said softly. "And now everyone here knows what you are. Not a king, not even a man. Just someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." He raised his voice so the crowd could hear. "I'm taking Miss Coulter with me. She'll have safe passage out of this town and enough money to start over. Anyone who interferes answers to me. Anyone who follows us dies." The words weren't a boast or a threat, just a simple statement of fact that no one doubted. He turned his back on Merrick, a gesture of contempt more cutting than any insult, and walked toward his horse. The crowd parted before him like water, people pressing back to give him space. Merrick stood there, his hand still on his pistol, his men bleeding in the dirt around him, and the humiliation on his face was absolute. But Mari knew him, knew men like him. Pride was more dangerous than fear, and a man who'd just been humiliated in front of his entire town was a cornered animal. She saw Merrick's hand tighten on his pistol, saw the muscle in his jaw jump as he made his decision. "Tavo!" she screamed from the window, her voice raw and desperate. "Behind you!" Tavo spun as Merrick drew, but the cattle baron had the advantage of surprise. His first shot went wild, kicking up dust near Tavo's boots. His second would have taken the Comanche in the chest if Doc Wilson hadn't stepped forward at that exact moment, his own pistol drawn. The old doctor's shot took Merrick in the hand, sending his silver-handled gun spinning into the dirt. The street exploded into chaos. Merrick screamed, clutching his shattered hand. His remaining men, the ones not injured by Tavo's shooting, burst from the ranch office with rifles. But they were met by an unexpected sight, townspeople stepping forward, some armed, others just placing themselves between Merrick's men and Tavo. Ben Tucker with his ancient shotgun, the blacksmith with a hammer, even the reverend standing with nothing but his Bible and a fierce expression. "Enough," Doc Wilson said, his voice carrying authority Mari had never heard from the gentle physician. 20 years I've watched you terrorize this town, Merrick. Watched you break good people and drive out anyone with spine enough to stand against you. But this man," he gestured to Tavo, "he showed us what we should have remembered. Evil only wins when good people stay silent." Other voices joined in, a chorus of agreement from people who'd been afraid too long. "My daughter left town because of you," someone shouted. "You stole my water rights," another called. The dam had broken, and years of suppressed anger came flooding out. Merrick's remaining men looked at each other uncertainly, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted dramatically. Merrick clutched his bleeding hand, his face twisted with rage and pain and disbelief. "You're all dead," he hissed. "Every last one of you. I'll call in favors from Amarillo, from Santa Fe. I'll burn this town to ashes." "No," a new voice said. Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. He'd been Merrick's man for years, paid to look the other way, but something in his expression had changed. "No, you won't. I'm done, Merrick. Done pretending the law doesn't apply to you." He pulled out handcuffs, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice steady. "Clayton Merrick, I'm arresting you for assault on Miss Coulter and attempted murder of—" He glanced at Tavo. "What's your full name, son?" "Davo Namine," the Comanche replied quietly. "It means eagle who hunts at dawn." The sheriff nodded and continued reading charges while Merrick sputtered protests that no one listened to. His empire, built over decades, was crumbling in minutes, and everyone could see it happening. Tavo looked up at Mari's window, and their eyes met across the distance. He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then mounted his horse with fluid grace. But he didn't ride away. Instead, he guided the paint stallion toward the building where Mari watched, and she realized with a start that he was coming for her, just as he'd promised. Beatrice helped her down the stairs, each step an agony that Mari barely felt through the haze of shock and laudanum, and something else, something that felt almost like hope. They emerged onto the street, just as Tavo dismounted, and the crowd parted to let him through. Up close she could see the strain in his face, the adrenaline still coursing through him, but his eyes were gentle as they found hers. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. Mari looked at her bandaged hands, at the crowd watching them with rapt attention, at Merrick being led away by the sheriff, while Doc Wilson tended to the wounded men. She looked at Beatrice, who was crying and smiling at the same time, and at Ben Tucker, who nodded encouragingly. She looked at this town that had tried to break her, at the people who'd watched it happen and done nothing until one man showed them how. "I can try," she said. Tavo lifted her onto his horse with infinite care, settling her in front of him so she could lean back against his chest. His arms came around her, taking the reins, and she felt safer than she had in years. "Where are we going?" she asked as he turned the stallion toward the edge of town. "Away from here. To my mother's people, where hands are valued for the work they do, not broken for showing kindness." His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "You'll heal there. And when your hands work again, if you choose to stay, there will be place for you. If you choose to leave, I'll take you wherever you want to go. The choice is yours." Mari felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of pain anymore. "Thank you," she whispered. "For coming back. For standing up. For seeing me." She felt rather than saw his smile. "You stood up first. I just made sure the bullies finally fell down." He urged the horse into a walk, and the crowd actually cheered, as they passed. Women waved, men called out thanks and blessings. Children ran alongside until they reached the town's edge. As they rode into the open prairie, Mari looked back one last time at Bent Creek. Smoke still rose from chimneys, and life would go on there, but it would be different now. Merrick's reign had ended not with a whimper, but with the thunderous proof that monsters could be stopped, that standing up mattered, that one person's courage could ignite a whole town's conscience. The sun was high and bright, warming Mari's face as they rode toward the horizon. Her hands still hurt, her shoulders still ached, but none of that mattered quite as much as it had before. Behind her, Tavo sat solid and warm, a presence that asked nothing and offered everything. Ahead lay unknown territory, healing that would take months, choices about a future she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since arriving in Texas with $2 and a prayer, Mari Coulter felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Not just hope, but possibility. Not just survival, but the chance to actually live. The prairie stretched endless and golden before them, and somewhere in that vastness was a place where broken things could mend, where kindness wasn't punished, where she might finally stop running. "Tell me about your mother's people," she said, settling more comfortably against Tavo's chest. And as they rode, he told her stories of lodges and communal fires, of women who were healers and leaders, of a life so different from everything she'd known that it sounded like a dream. Mari listened with her eyes closed, letting his deep voice wash over her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed that dreams might actually come true. The horses' steady rhythm carried them farther from Bent Creek with each passing moment, and Mari didn't look back again. There was nothing behind her worth seeing, and everything ahead worth reaching for. Her hands might be broken, but her spirit, battered and scarred as it was, remained whole. And that, she was beginning to understand, was what mattered most. The journey to Tavo's mother's people took 3 days of steady riding through terrain that shifted from scrubby prairie to rolling hills thick with mesquite and live oak. Mari had never seen country so vast, so empty of the structures and boundaries that white settlements imposed on the land. Here the world seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, unconcerned with human ownership or the petty violence of men like Clayton Merrick. Tavo rode with the ease of someone born to the saddle, his body moving in perfect harmony with the paint stallion beneath them. He spoke little during the days, but his silences were comfortable rather than cold, filled with attention to the land around them and to Mari's comfort. Each evening he would stop early, building a small fire and preparing simple meals of jerky, dried corn, and whatever small game he managed to catch. He fed her with patient hands, never commenting on her helplessness, never making her feel like a burden. The nights were harder. Pain from her broken hands would intensify as the laudanum wore off, and Mari would lie awake staring at stars so numerous they seemed like holes punched in black canvas. Tavo would sit nearby, keeping watch, and sometimes he would tell her stories. Stories of Coyote the trickster, of how the Comanche came to possess horses, of his own childhood following the buffalo herds before the white soldiers came and forced his people onto reservations. "My father was killed when I was 12, he told her on the second night, his voice steady but carrying old grief. He refused to move to the reservation, said the land belonged to no man, that fencing the prairie was like trying to cage the wind. The soldiers shot him for horse theft, though the horses had always been ours. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkness. My mother took me and my sister to her brother's band. They had accepted the reservation, made peace, but it was a bitter peace that tasted like ash." Mari listened, understanding in a way she hadn't before. They were both refugees in their own fashion, both fleeing from worlds that had tried to break them. "Is that why you speak English so well?" she asked. "The mission school." Tavo nodded. 3 years with the Franciscans. They meant well, I suppose, by their own lights. Thought they could save our souls by killing our spirits. But some things cannot be killed, only driven deeper. On the 3rd day, they crested a hill, and Mari saw smoke rising from what looked like a small valley, sheltered by limestone bluffs. As they drew closer, she could make out teepees, arranged in a loose circle, horses grazing nearby, and people moving about their daily tasks. Her heart began to race. She'd heard terrible stories about Indians, tales of savagery and violence that every white child learned with their letters. But she'd also learned that men who told such stories were often the greatest savages themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The camp noticed their approach long before they arrived. Riders came out to meet them, young men on swift ponies who circled Tavo's horse with whoops of greeting. They spoke in rapid Comanche, too fast for Mari to catch anything beyond Tavo's name and what sounded like questions. Tavo answered calmly, gesturing occasionally to Mari, and she felt dozens of curious eyes assessing her. An older woman emerged from the largest teepee as they rode into camp. She was perhaps 60, her face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of hard years and harder choices, her hair still black despite her age and braided with strips of red cloth. She wore a dress of deerskin decorated with intricate quillwork, and she carried herself with an authority that needed no announcement. This was clearly someone of importance. Tavo dismounted and spoke to the woman in their language, his tone respectful. She listened, her dark eyes flicking repeatedly to Mari, then asked what sounded like pointed questions. Mari caught the words for white and woman and what might have been broken. Finally, the older woman nodded and approached the horse where Mari still sat. "I am Nadua," she said in heavily accented but clear English. "Tavo's mother. He says you helped him when others would not. That you paid a price for simple kindness." She reached up and touched Mari's bandaged hands with surprising gentleness. "We know about prices. You are welcome here, for as long as you need." Relief flooded through Mari so intensely it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "I don't want to be a burden. I can work once my hands heal. I can learn." Nadua's weathered face creased into a smile. "Everyone works here. Everyone learns. There are no burdens, only people." She turned and called out something in Comanche, and several women approached, their faces curious but not unkind. "These are my daughters and nieces. They will help you. Come." The next hours passed in a blur of new experiences. The women helped Mari down from the horse, supporting her when her legs threatened to give out after 3 days of riding. They led her to a teepee that smelled of smoke and sage, and something else, some herb Mari couldn't identify. Inside it was surprisingly spacious and organized, with sleeping robes arranged along the edges and a fire pit in the center vented through the top. One of the younger women, who introduced herself as Keme, brought water and clean cloths. She spoke no English, but communicated through gestures and expressions that transcended language. With gentle hands, she helped Mari remove her trail-dusty dress and washed her with warm water that had been heated over the fire. The kindness of it, the simple human care, made Mari want to weep. Nadua appeared with fresh clothing, a simple deerskin dress that was softer than anything Mari had ever worn. "This was my daughter's," she said quietly. "She died 2 winters ago of the white man's spotted sickness. She would want it worn by someone who needs it." The gift felt sacred somehow, and Mari accepted it with a gratitude that went beyond words. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of copper and gold, Mari sat outside the teepee and watched the camp's rhythms. Children played games she didn't recognize, their laughter universal. Women worked on various tasks, tanning hides, preparing food, sewing and beading. Men tended horses, repaired weapons, talked in groups. It was so different from Bent Creek, yet also strangely similar. People finding ways to survive, to maintain dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. Tavo appeared as darkness fell, carrying a bowl of stew that smelled of sage and venison. "You should eat," he said, settling beside her. "Mother says you're too thin." Mari wanted to feed herself, hated her helplessness, but her bandaged hands made it impossible. Tavo seemed to understand her frustration. "Accepting help isn't weakness," he said quietly. "It's wisdom. We all need help sometimes." As he fed her small bites, Mari studied his face in the firelight. "Why did you really come back for me?" she asked. And don't say it was just about kindness. Men don't risk their lives for a meal and a smile." Tavo was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible?" He finally said, "To walk into a room and see people look through you or past you, but never at you." Mari nodded. "Every day of my life." He met her eyes. "You looked at me. Really looked. Not at what I was supposed to be, not at the stories people told about me, but at me. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" His voice dropped lower. "I've known white women who lay with me in secret and spit when I passed them on the street. I've known white men who called me friend and then voted to steal our land. But you served me food in front of everyone who mattered and didn't flinch when it cost you everything." "It cost me my hands," Mari said, but there was no bitterness in her voice now, just statement of fact. Tavo shook his head. "It revealed your strength. Merrick broke your bones, but he couldn't break what made you willing to stand up in the first place. That's what I saw. That's why I came back." The days that followed fell into a pattern that was simultaneously strange and comforting. Each morning, Nadua would unwrap Mari's bandages, examine the healing bones with practiced eyes, and apply poultices made from plants Mari didn't recognize. The older woman had been a healer among her people for decades, and her knowledge of medicine was deeper than anything Doc Wilson had shown. The white doctors. They fix the bone but forget the spirit, Nadua explained one morning as she worked. Pain lives in both places. Must heal both. She would massage Mari's forearms and wrists with oils that smelled of cedar and something sharper, working the muscles that had begun to atrophy. The treatments hurt, but it was a different kind of pain, one that promised healing rather than destruction. Mari learned quickly that everyone in the camp had responsibilities, and being injured didn't exempt her. The women found tasks she could do with splinted hands, sorting dried corn, watching children, holding materials while others worked. She learned words in Comanche, Pia for mother, Tua for son, Puha for the spiritual power that Nadua said lived in all things. The language felt strange in her mouth, but the women were patient teachers, laughing kindly at her mispronunciations. Kemi became something like a friend, despite the language barrier. She was perhaps 20, married to one of the young warriors who'd ridden out to meet them and expecting her first child. She would sit with Mari in the evenings, teaching her songs and showing her how various tasks were done. Through gestures and simple words, Mari learned that Kemi's husband had died in a raid 2 years ago, that she'd remarried out of necessity more than love, that she worried about bringing a child into a world where their way of life was dying. "The reservation," she would say, one of the few English words she knew, and her face would cloud with an emotion Mari understood too well. Fear of the future, grief for a past that couldn't be reclaimed, and a desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, things might work out. They were feelings Mari had carried for so long she'd thought they were unique to her. Finding them reflected in Kem's eyes created a bond deeper than language. Tavo was often away during the days, hunting or scouting or attending to whatever business a warrior handled. But he would return each evening, checking on Mari with an attentiveness that made her heart ache. He never touched her beyond what was necessary, never presumed anything, but the way he looked at her spoke volumes, like she was something precious, like she mattered. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks into her stay, Mari was sitting by the fire attempting to braid grass with her still splinted fingers when Nadua sat beside her. The older woman watched her struggle for a moment, then gently took the grass away. "You are afraid," she observed. "It wasn't a question," Mari nodded. "Of many things. That my hands won't heal right, that I'll be useless, that I'm intruding here where I don't belong." She paused, then added more quietly, "that what I feel for your son is foolish and one-sided." Nadua's laugh was rich and warm. "My son looks at you the way his father looked at me before the soldiers came. Like you are water in the desert, like you are the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking." She took Mari's bandaged hands in her own weathered ones. "But you are right to be afraid of some things. This life, it is not easy. The white world pushes us smaller every year. My people, we are not wild Indians of the stories. We are people trying to survive in a world that wants us dead or tamed." "I know something about that," Mari said quietly. Nadua studied her with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Yes, I think you do. That is why I allow you here, why I teach you. Not because my son wants it, though he does, but because you understand what it means to be pushed to the edges, to fight for every breath. We need people who understand that. We need each other." The conversation stayed with Mari as the days turned into weeks. Her hands were healing, slowly but noticeably. The swelling had gone down, and Nadua began removing the splints for longer periods each day, encouraging her to gently flex her fingers. The pain was still present, but had shifted from acute agony to a dull, manageable ache. More importantly, her fingers moved, not well yet, but they moved. She began contributing more to camp life. With Kame's patient instruction, she learned to prepare hides, to grind corn between stones, to identify edible plants on the prairie. The work was hard and her hands tired quickly, but she pushed through, desperate to prove she wasn't just a burden. The women seemed to respect her determination, including her more in their conversations, teaching her more complex words and phrases. One morning, Tavo asked if she would ride with him. "There's something I want to show you," he said, and the expression on his face was lighter than she'd seen before, almost boyish. She agreed, and he lifted her onto his paint stallion, swinging up behind her. They rode out of camp, heading toward the limestone bluffs that sheltered the valley. The trail climbed steadily, winding between rocks and stunted oaks, until they emerged onto a plateau that overlooked miles of rolling prairie. The view was breathtaking, endless grassland stretching to the horizon under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "This is where I come to think," Tavo said, dismounting and helping her down. "When the world becomes too much, when I need to remember why we fight to survive." They sat on a flat rock, and for a while neither spoke, just absorbed the vastness and the silence. Finally, Mari said, "Your mother told me about your father, about how he died." "I'm sorry," Tavo nodded slowly. "He was a stubborn man, proud. He couldn't accept that our time was ending, that the buffalo were nearly gone, that the white soldiers were too many. He thought if we just fought hard enough, refused loudly enough, things would go back to how they were." "Do you think he was wrong?" Mari asked. Tavo considered the question. "He was right about what was worth fighting for. But he was wrong about how to win. You can't defeat an army with pride alone. Sometimes survival means adapting, finding new ways to preserve what matters most." He turned to look at her. "Like you did. You couldn't defeat Merrick with strength, but you defeated him by making me care enough to come back." Mari felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't make you do anything." His hand moved to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "No, but you made me want to. That's more powerful than any order or obligation." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her lips. "Mari, I need you to understand something. My world, it's not the world you came from. It's harder in some ways, different in all ways. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to build a life here with these people—" He paused, searching for words. "With me, I would count myself the most fortunate man alive." Her broken hands came up to rest against his chest, clumsy and still wrapped in bandages, but the gesture was clear. "I have nowhere else I want to be," she whispered. "Nothing else I want to become. Teach me. Help me belong here. That's all I ask." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she were something infinitely precious and equally fragile. The kiss tasted like hope and sage smoke, and the promise of futures neither of them could quite imagine. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had moved lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of amber. They returned to camp as evening fell, and Mari noticed Nadua watching them with a knowing smile. That night, there was a celebration, though Mari didn't understand what they were celebrating until Keme managed to explain through gestures and simple words. A marriage had been arranged between two young people in the camp, and there would be feasting and dancing. Mari watched the preparations with fascination, helping where she could. As darkness fell and fires were lit, the drumming began. The rhythm was complex and hypnotic, speaking to something primal in Mari's chest. People began to dance, movements both ceremonial and joyful, and she watched Tavo join them, his body moving with a grace that took her breath away. Later, he pulled her to her feet, ignoring her protests about her hands, and showed her simple steps she could manage. They danced together under stars that seemed close enough to touch, and Mari felt something she'd never experienced before, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. But peace, as always, was fragile. 3 days later, a rider came into camp at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grim with news. Mari was helping Nadua prepare breakfast when the commotion started, warriors gathering in urgent conversation. Tavo emerged from the crowd and came straight to her, his expression dark. "We have to leave," he said without preamble. "Now all of us." Mari's stomach dropped. "What's happened?" Tavo glanced back at the gathered men, then met her eyes. "Soldiers. A cavalry unit from Fort Concho, heading this way. Someone told them about an unlawful Indian camp hiding off the reservation. We have maybe 2 days before they arrive, and when they come, they won't be interested in explanations." The camp exploded into organized chaos, everyone moving with practiced efficiency, born of too many forced migrations. Dipis was struck, belongings packed onto travois, children gathered. Mari moved through it all in a daze, helping where she could with hands that still ached, but were strong enough now for simple tasks. She found Keme frantically packing, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her swollen belly. "We run again," Keme said in broken English, her voice thick with grief and rage. "Always run, never home, never safe." Mari embraced her, this woman who'd become a friend despite every difference between them, and felt her own anger rising. How many times could people be pushed before they simply broke? How much running could a soul endure? As they prepared to leave, Mari looked back at the valley that had given her sanctuary, at the place where her hands had begun to heal and her heart had learned to hope again. They were leaving because someone had decided they didn't belong, because invisible lines on maps mattered more than human dignity. It was a story she knew too well, just told with different details. Tavo found her as they were loading the last of the supplies. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wanted you to have more time. To heal completely." Mari touched his face with her still tender hands. "I'm healed enough. And wherever we go, as long as we go together, that's home enough for me." But even as she said it, she wondered how long they could keep running, and what would be left of them when the running finally stopped. The exodus began before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. A ragged column of people and horses and hastily packed belongings stretching across the prairie like a wound. Mari rode beside Tavo near the middle of the group, watching elderly people struggle with bundles too heavy for their years, watching children try to understand why home had once again become something they had to leave behind. The injustice of it burned in her chest like swallowed coals. They traveled hard for 2 days, pushing north and west toward more remote territory where the cavalry might not follow. The pace was brutal for those unaccustomed to it, and Mari's healing hands ached from gripping the saddle, but she didn't complain. Around her, people twice her age moved with grim determination, carrying burdens that would have broken her months ago. If they could endure, so could she. On the second night, they made camp in a canyon carved by some ancient river, its red stone walls providing shelter and concealment. The people were exhausted, moving with the mechanical motions of those pushed beyond their limits. Fires were kept small and smokeless, guards posted on the canyon rim. The usual sounds of camp life, children's laughter and easy conversation were absent. Fear had settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Mari helped Kem erect her teepee, noting how the pregnant woman moved more slowly now, one hand constantly pressed to her lower back. "How much longer?" Mari asked in her still halting Comanche, gesturing to Kim's belly. The younger woman held up 2 fingers, then made a circular motion that Mari interpreted as 2 moons. 2 months. And they were running through rough country with cavalry on their trail. Nadua appeared as they finished, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her spine still straight. "Come," she said to Marie, "there is something you must see." She led Marie to where the council was gathering, a circle of older men and women seated on blankets spread on the canyon floor. Tavo was there, and he looked up as they approached, something uncertain in his expression. "The council wants to speak with you," Nadwa said quietly. "About what happened in Bent Creek, about why you're here." Marie's stomach tightened with anxiety. She'd known this moment would come eventually, when she'd have to justify her presence among people who had every reason to distrust whites. She settled onto the blanket beside Tavo, acutely aware of the eyes assessing her. An older man, whose face was a map of hard years, spoke first, his English slow but clear. "I am Esihabitu. I was war chief before we accepted the reservation." He paused, weighing his words. "My son tells me you have suffered at the hands of your own people, that you defended him when others would not. This is good, but we must know, why should we trust you? Your people have broken every promise, stolen every gift, turned every kindness into weakness to exploit." The words stung because they were true, and Marie had no defense against truth. She looked at her bandaged hands, at the evidence of exactly what Esihabitu described, then met his eyes. "You shouldn't trust me," she said clearly. "Not because of anything I've done, but because trust has to be earned, and I haven't had time to earn it. All I can tell you is that the world that broke my hands is the same world that's chasing you now, the same world that killed Tavo's father and took your lands. I can't undo any of that, but I can stand with you against it, for whatever that's worth." Another elder, a woman with silver braids and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Words are easy. The white world is full of pretty words. What can you do? What use are you to us?" It was a fair question, brutally stated. Marie thought about all the things she couldn't do, all the ways she was still broken. Then she thought about what she'd learned in the weeks at camp. "I can read and write English," she said. "I can help with negotiations, with understanding the treaties they'll try to force on you. I know how white merchants think, how to get fair prices for goods. I can teach children English so they'll have weapons to fight with besides guns and pride." She paused, then added more quietly, "And I can remember. I can be a witness to what happens, to what's done to you. Someone who can tell the truth to people who might actually listen." The council members exchanged glances, some skeptical, others thoughtful. Esihabitu studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We will see. Words and promises mean nothing until tested by time and trouble. You may stay with us, but understand, if you betray us, if you bring harm to my people through carelessness or malice, Tavo's affection will not save you." The threat was clear and somehow comforting in its honesty. The council dispersed, and Marie sat trembling with released tension. Yevo's hand found hers, careful of her healing bones. "That went better than I expected," he said with a slight smile. "Esihabitu once voted to kill a white trader who cheated us. That he's willing to give you a chance means something." Marie wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. The days that followed were harder than anything Marie had experienced. They continued moving, always north and west, through country that grew increasingly rough and barren. Water became scarce, and they were forced to ration carefully. The elderly struggled, and one old man died in his sleep on the fourth night. His body wrapped and left in a cave, with what ceremony they could manage while fleeing. Marie pushed herself harder than she probably should have, determined to prove she wasn't dead weight. Her hands were improving daily under Nadua's continued treatment, and she could now grip reins and help with camp tasks, though extended use left them aching and stiff. She learned to ignore the pain, to push through when her body wanted to quit. Around her, people twice her age did the same, and their example shamed any thought of complaint into silence. On the 6th day, scouts reported that the cavalry had reached their old camp and found it abandoned. They were following the trail but moving slowly, cautious of ambush. This bought them time, but everyone knew the soldiers would eventually catch up. The question was, what would happen when they did? That night Tavo took Marie aside after the evening meal. They climbed to a high point overlooking the camp, watching the small fires flicker in the growing darkness. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice heavy. "Tomorrow some of us are going back. We'll set up a false trail, lead the soldiers away from the main group. By time for the elderly and children to reach safer territory." Mari's blood went cold. "That's suicide." "If they catch you," Tavo's hand on her arm silenced her. "If they catch us, we'll fight or surrender depending on the situation. But someone has to do this, Mari. We can't keep running like this. The old ones are dying. The children are exhausted. We need time, and this is how we buy it." His eyes found hers in the dimness. "I need you to stay with the main group. Help my mother, help Kemi when her time comes. Be the witness you promised to be." "No," Mari said flatly. "If you're going, I'm going with you." Tavo shook his head. "You're not ready. Your hands—" She held up her hands, bandages mostly removed now, revealing the pink scars and slight crookedness where bones had healed imperfectly. "My hands work well enough. And I'm not asking permission, Tavo. I'm telling you. We stand together or not at all." He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "You're stubborn as a mule," he muttered. "It's one of the things I love about you." The casual admission of love, stated like simple fact rather than grand declaration, made Mari's throat tight. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling the solid reality of him, and tried not to think about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. The group that rode out at dawn numbered 12. Tavo, 3 other young warriors, 2 older men who'd fought in the wars before the reservation, and Mari. They carried minimal supplies, planning to move fast and unpredictable. The goal was simple: create a trail that looked like the whole band fleeing east toward the reservation. Draw the cavalry after them, then lose the soldiers in the broken country before circling back to rejoin the main group. Simple in concept, treacherous in execution. They rode hard through the morning, deliberately leaving obvious signs. Trampled grass, disturbed stones, even a few items dropped as if by accident. By midday, scouts confirmed the cavalry had taken the bait and turned east. Now came the dangerous part, staying ahead while making the trail convincing. They pushed into increasingly rough terrain, all red rock canyons and hidden arroyos, where a single misstep could kill a horse. Mari's hands screamed at her as she gripped reins and saddle horn, navigating treacherous descents, but she gritted her teeth and kept up. Around her, the men moved with the fluid confidence of people who'd grown up in this country, reading the land like a language she was only beginning to learn. By evening of the second day, the cavalry was close enough that they could see dust from the column rising in the distance. Too close. One of the warriors, a young man named Tosawihi, reported that the soldiers numbered at least 30, well-armed and determined. The numbers weren't favorable, but then they never had been. They made cold camp that night in a narrow canyon, no fires, speaking in whispers. Mari sat with her back against stone that still held the day's heat, watching Tavo clean his rifles with methodical care. The other men did the same, checking ammunition, testing bowstrings, preparing for violence they hoped wouldn't come, but knew probably would. "Tell me about your sister," Mari said quietly, needing to hear about something beyond tomorrow's dangers. Tavo looked up, surprised by the question, then smiled slightly. "Nahapu. She was younger than me by 3 years, fierce as a cornered badger and twice as stubborn. She refused to wear the dresses the mission school insisted on, kept running away until they finally gave up and let her wear leggings like the boys." His expression softened with memory. "She wanted to be a warrior, used to practice with a bow until her fingers bled. Father said she had the heart for it, but the world wouldn't allow it. She married a man from another band, moved north. I haven't seen her in 4 years." The longing in his voice was palpable. "This world, it scatters us like seeds in wind. Odd to put down roots when you're always flying apart." Mari reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "After this is over, we'll find her. We'll gather everyone who's been scattered and make a place where roots can actually grow, somehow." It was a ridiculous promise, given their circumstances, but Tavo squeezed her hand gratefully, accepting the comfort if not the likelihood. The attack came at dawn, sudden and overwhelming. The cavalry had moved through the night, cutting off their escape route south. Mari woke to gunfire and shouting, soldiers pouring into the canyon from both ends like water filling a basin. The world exploded into chaos, horses screaming, bullets ricocheting off stone, men yelling orders in English and Comanche. The bow was already moving, returning fire with deadly precision. But there were too many soldiers, too few of them. "The side canyon," he shouted, pointing to a narrow cleft in the rock wall. "Go now." The group ran for it, but Mari saw immediately that not everyone would make it. Tosawihi went down, hit in the leg, and one of the older warriors fell trying to help him. Mari made a decision without thinking. She grabbed Tavo's rifle from where he'd dropped it to use his pistols and fired at the nearest soldier, not to kill, but to provide cover. The rifle's kick nearly knocked her over, sending agony through her still healing hands, but she worked the lever and fired again. Tavo stared at her for a split second, surprise and pride warring on his face, then nodded and kept shooting. They managed to reach the side canyon, dragging wounded with them, but it was obvious they were trapped. The passage dead-ended at a rockfall perhaps 200 yards in. The soldiers had them cornered, and it was only a matter of time before they either charged or simply waited them out. Mari's hands shook as she reloaded, her palms bleeding where barely healed bones had cracked under the rifle's stress. She'd bought them minutes at best. A voice echoed off the canyon walls, magnified and distorted by the stone. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Cavalry. You're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now and you'll be treated fairly, taken to the reservation unharmed. Continue resisting, and we'll have no choice but to use force." The words were almost kind, if you ignored the guns behind them. Tavo looked at his remaining men. 3 warriors still capable of fighting, 2 wounded, and Mari. His face was grim as he calculated odds that couldn't be calculated in their favor. "We can fight," he said quietly. "Die here in this canyon, or we can surrender, take our chances with the reservation." Neither option felt like winning. "There's a third choice," Mari said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Let me talk to them. Not surrender, not fight, talk." Tavo started to protest, but she cut him off. "I'm white. I speak their language. Maybe I can negotiate something, buy us time to figure out a better option. Or maybe I'll fail and we're no worse off than we are now." She saw him working through the logic, hating it but unable to find a flaw. Finally he nodded. "If they shoot you, I'll kill every last one of them before I die." It was said with such absolute certainty that Mari almost believed it possible. She stepped out of cover, hands raised high despite the pain it caused, and walked toward the canyon entrance. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe, every instinct screaming at her to run back to cover. But she kept walking, step after step, until she stood in the open where the soldiers could see her clearly. "I'm coming out," she called. "Don't shoot. I'm unarmed and I want to talk." The soldiers looked confused, rifles trained on her but fingers hesitating on triggers. A man rode forward, his uniform marking him as an officer. He was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. "Who are you?" he asked, studying her dress and her obvious injuries with sharp attention. "My name is Marianne Coulter. I'm from Bent Creek, and I'm traveling with these people by choice. They're not raiders or hostiles, Captain. They're families trying to survive, running from soldiers who want to force them onto reservation land that can't support them." She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. "Half of them are elderly or children. They just want to be left alone." Morrison's expression was skeptical. "Miss Coulter, these Indians left the reservation illegally. It's my duty to return them. The fact that you're with them, willingly or not, doesn't change that." He paused, then added more gently, "You look injured. Why don't you come with us? We can get you medical attention, return you to your people. These are my people now," Mari said fiercely. "And the only reason I'm injured is because white men broke my hands for serving a Comanche warrior a meal. So don't talk to me about civilization or duty or who my people are supposed to be." The captain's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise crossing his features. Behind her, she heard movement and turned to see Tavo emerging from the side canyon. his weapons holstered but his hands ready to draw. He came to stand beside her, a solid presence at her shoulder. "I'm the warrior she served," he said calmly. "Tavonamene, and she speaks truth. We mean no harm to anyone. We only want to live as our ancestors lived, free and unconfined." Morrison studied them both for a long moment, and Mari saw something shift in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. "I have orders," he said finally, "but I also have discretion in how I carry them out." He turned in his saddle, looking back at his men. "Stand down. Lower your weapons." To Mari's amazement, the soldiers complied. Morrison dismounted and walked closer, though he kept his hand near his sidearm. "Here's what I can offer. You and your people head to the reservation. I'll escort you personally, make sure you're treated fairly, given decent allotments. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise I won't let anyone abuse you in my presence." He looked at Tavo. "It's the best deal you're going to get. Take it or face a fight you can't win." Tavo's jaw was tight, every line of his body radiating resistance to the idea. But he was also practical enough to recognize truth when he heard it. "The others," he said. "The ones who went north. You'll let them go? Not pursue them?" Morrison considered, then nodded slowly. "I never saw them. My orders were to investigate reports of Indians in this area. I found a small group and am returning them to the reservation. That's all my report will say. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't victory. But it was survival, and sometimes that had to be enough." Devo looked at Mari, a question in his eyes. She nodded, supporting whatever he decided. He turned back to Morrison and said the hardest word in any language. "Yes." The journey to the reservation took 5 more days. True to his word, Captain Morrison treated them fairly, ensuring his men showed respect, allowing them to travel at a pace that accommodated the wounded. He even shared army rations when their own supplies ran low. Mari spent the time talking with him during evening camps, learning that he'd fought in the war between the states, had seen enough killing to last several lifetimes, and had 3 daughters back in Virginia who he missed desperately. "I don't like this any more than you do," he admitted one night. "Herding people onto land they don't want, forcing them to live ways that aren't natural to them. But the alternative is extinction. At least on the reservation there's a chance. A small one, but a chance." Murray wanted to argue but found she couldn't. He was probably right. And that might have been the most depressing realization of all. "'Tis to see," Psalm. When they finally reached the reservation, Murray's first impression was of dust and despair. Rows of identical canvas tents stretched across barren ground, surrounded by fences that might as well have been prison walls. People moved listlessly between structures, their eyes hollow with the look of those who'd given up fighting. This was supposed to be sanctuary, she thought bitterly. This was supposed to be the solution. But then she saw familiar faces emerging from tents, recognizing Tavo and rushing forward with exclamations of relief and joy. Ndua was there, and Keme and the others who'd fled north. They'd made it here safely, found their way to this place that was both prison and refuge. And seeing them alive, seeing families reunited, Mari felt some small ember of hope kindle in her chest. They'd survived, against ridiculous odds. Through impossible circumstances, they'd survived. Tavo found her that evening, sitting outside the tent they'd been assigned, watching the sun set over the fence line. He settled beside her, their shoulders touching, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, Mari said, "This isn't what I imagined when you said I could build a life with your people." "No," Tavo agreed. "It's not what any of us imagined. But we're here together and we're alive. That's more than many can say." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the last light. "The question is, can you stay? Can you build a life in this place? Because it won't be easy, Mari. It won't be the prairie we left or the camp you healed in. It'll be this day after day, until something changes or we die." Mari thought about Bent Creek, about the Dusty Rose Saloon and Virgil's cowardice and Merrick's cruelty. She thought about all the places she'd run from and run to, always searching for somewhere that felt like home. She looked at her hands, scarred and imperfect but working again, capable of holding on to what mattered. Then she looked at Tavo, this man who'd risked everything for her, who'd shown her that standing up was possible, even when standing up meant falling. "Home isn't a place," she said finally. "It's people. It's the ones who see you and don't look away. The ones who stand with you when standing means bleeding." She took his hand, lacing their crooked fingers together. "I can build a life anywhere, as long as you're building it beside me. Even here, especially here." Tavo pulled her close, and they sat there as darkness fell over the reservation, two people who'd been broken by the world and put themselves back together into something new. Around them, the camp settled into night, and somewhere nearby a child laughed. A sound of pure joy that seemed impossible in this place but persisted anyway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new indignities, new reasons to despair. But tonight, they had each other, they had survival, and they had the stubborn, irrational hope that somehow, despite everything, things might eventually get better. It wasn't much, but for two people who'd started with nothing, it was everything. The reservation changed them all, but not in the ways the government intended. 6 months after their arrival, Mari stood in the doorway of the small wooden cabin that had replaced their canvas tent, watching the morning sun paint the compound in shades of amber and dust. Her hands, fully healed now, though forever marked by slight crookedness in 2 fingers, held a cup of coffee made from grounds she'd bartered for with sewing work. It was a small luxury, but small luxuries had become the currency of survival. Behind her, Tavo stirred on their shared pallet, then rose, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd never quite adjusted to sleeping in enclosed spaces. He moved to stand beside her, his arms settling around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Kem's time is close," he said quietly. "Mother says perhaps today?" Mari nodded, already mentally preparing what would be needed. In the months since their arrival, she'd become Nadua's apprentice in healing, learning the medicinal properties of plants and the old ways of easing birth and mending injury. Her hands, once broken for showing kindness, now worked daily to preserve life in a place designed to extinguish it slowly. By mid-morning, Kem's labor had begun, her water breaking as she helped prepare corn for grinding. Nadua and 2 other older women swept her into the birthing lodge, while Mari gathered supplies, clean cloths, warm water, the herbs Nadua had taught her to brew into teas that eased pain and strengthened contractions. Tavo watched her work with quiet pride, this woman who'd arrived broken and helpless and had transformed herself into someone essential. The labor was long and difficult. Kem was young and strong, but the baby was positioned badly, and hours passed with little progress. Mari held the young woman's hand, whispering encouragement in a mix of English and Comanche, while Nadua worked with gentle, experienced hands to turn the child. The other women sang old songs, their voices weaving a net of sound meant to guide the new life safely into the world. Just before full dark, when the stars were beginning to pierce the purple sky, a thin wail split the evening air. Mari watched Nadua lift a tiny, squalling infant into the lamplight. A girl, perfect and furious at her abrupt arrival into this harsh world. Keme, exhausted and radiant, reached for her daughter with shaking arms, and the baby quieted at her mother's touch. "She's beautiful," Mari whispered, and meant it. In this place of so much loss, new life felt like a small miracle. Nadua wrapped the infant in soft deerskin before placing her in Kem's arms. The young mother looked up at Mari with tears streaming down her face and said something in rapid Comanche. "She thanks you," Nadua translated quietly, "and she wants to name the baby after you. Mera, as close as our tongue can come to your name. She says you brought hope when there was none." Mari felt her own eyes burning with tears. She'd done so little, just held a hand and whispered encouragement, but apparently small acts still mattered, even here. The celebration that followed was modest by necessity. Food was rationed on the reservation, and they had little to spare, but everyone contributed something: a handful of cornmeal, a strip of dried meat, wild onions someone had found growing by the creek. They made a stew that stretched to feed everyone, and someone produced a drum. And for a few hours, the reservation felt less like a prison and more like a community choosing joy despite every reason for despair. Mari danced with Tavo under stars that cared nothing for boundaries or treaties. Her scarred hands clasped in his, and felt something she'd never expected to feel again: contentment. Not happiness exactly, because happiness seemed too fragile a word for a life built on such precarious foundations. But contentment, the deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the celebration wound down, Tavo pulled Mari aside to a quiet spot near the fence line. From here, they could see beyond the reservation boundaries to the open prairie stretching dark and limitless toward the horizon. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what comes next." Mari waited, knowing he'd get to his point in his own time. "This place, it's not what we wanted," Tavo continued. "But it's given us something: time. Time to learn their ways, understand their systems, find the cracks we can exploit. Time to prepare for whatever comes next." His eyes were distant, looking at something she couldn't see. "Maybe we use this time to build something new. Not the old ways, because those are dying, but not their ways either. Something in between." "That's a beautiful dream," she said gently. "But how?" Tavo took her hands, his thumbs tracing the crooked fingers that told the story of her breaking and healing. "The same way you learned to work again after Merrick shattered these. One day at a time, teaching children to read so they have weapons besides violence, learning their laws so we know how to fight them, building alliances with whites who still have conscience. People like Captain Morrison," Mari said, understanding. "People like you," Tavo corrected. "You're our bridge, Mari. You walk between worlds in a way I never can. When you speak, white men listen in a way they'll never listen to me. That's not fair, it's not right, but it's true. And we can use that truth." The weight of what he was suggesting settled over Mari like a mantle. He was asking her to be more than a healer, more than a wife, more than a survivor. He was asking her to be a voice for people who'd been systematically silenced. It was a crushing responsibility, and part of her wanted to refuse, but she looked at her hands, at the evidence that she'd already been broken and survived it. She thought of Kem's baby, named in her honor, and of all the children who'd be born in this place, who deserved better than resignation and despair. She thought of the community that had accepted her despite every reason to reject her, of Tavo himself, who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten she had any. "I'll try," she said finally. "I can't promise I'll succeed, but I'll try." Tavo pulled her close, and they stood there in the darkness. Two people from different worlds who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to build something new from the rubble. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when the weight seemed too much to bear. But they'd start tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, with the stubborn persistence of people who'd learned that survival itself was a form of resistance. Inside the reservation, fires were banking down for the night. Somewhere a baby cried, and Mari recognized little Mera's voice, already distinct and demanding. Maid would be nursing her, whispering promises about the life she'd have, the world she'd inherit. It was a world still full of injustice and cruelty, but also one that held people who proved that change was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Mari's hands, once broken for the crime of seeing a Comanche warrior as human, now rested on the fence that both imprisoned and protected them. Those hands would write letters to sympathetic politicians, would tend sick children, would help build a future that honored both the old ways and the necessary adaptations. They weren't perfect hands, would never again work quite as they had before, but their imperfection had become their strength. They bore witness to what she'd survived, what she'd learned, who she'd become. "Come," Tavo said. "Tomorrow will be hard enough without facing it exhausted." He was right. Tomorrow they'd wake to the same rations, the same restrictions, the same slow erosion of dignity that defined reservation life. But they'd also wake to a community that cared for its own, to work that mattered to each other. And that would have to be enough. As they walked back to their cabin, Mari looked up at the stars one more time. They were the same stars that had watched humans struggle and survive for thousands of years, indifferent to borders and treaties and the petty cruelties people inflicted on each other. Those stars had seen empires rise and fall, and they'd seen something else too, the stubborn persistence of people who refused to be broken, who found ways to love and hope and build even in the darkest times. Inside their small cabin, they lay down together, Tavo's arm around her waist, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the reservation slept, and beyond it, the prairie stretched endless and free, waiting for the day when the people would reclaim it. That day might not come in their lifetimes, might not come for generations, but it would come. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Tavo's arm tightened around her. "I know. You show me every day." It wasn't a declaration returned in kind, but it was something better, acknowledgement that love was measured not in words, but in daily choices, in standing together when standing was hard, in building hope from the wreckage of broken dreams. Sleep took them both eventually. Two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and made from it the best of lives. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they had warmth and safety and each other. In a world determined to break them, they'd found a way not just to survive, but to thrive, and that quiet defiance was its own form of victory. The story of the Saloon Maid, whose hands were broken for showing kindness to a Comanche warrior, had not ended with violence or despair. It had ended here, in a small cabin on a reservation that was both prison and sanctuary, with two people who'd learned that the greatest act of defiance was simply to survive with dignity intact. They'd been tested by cruelty, by injustice, by a world that had tried to break them in every possible way. And they'd endured, not unchanged, certainly not unscathed, but endured nonetheless. And in that endurance lay the seeds of something greater than either of them alone, the possibility of a future worth fighting for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.